This morning we begin a 4-week journey on matters of faith. The topics for today, next week, the following, and into July 2nd have been submitted and inspired by members of the congregation. As we have asked you to share with us those questions and those issues which you as a Christian, as a person of faith, grapple with each and every day, those which guide us and nurture us and challenge us. And this morning, we deal with a most difficult question, a most common question that came to us in the form of why. Why does God allow? Why does God allow bad things to happen to good people? Why does God allow suffering and sickness and famine and war? Why does God allow disease and poverty? It's hard to answer those questions. It's especially hard to answer those questions within certain time constraints. And over the next 4 weeks, I would imagine, at least I hope, that you leave here from worship probably with fewer answers, but even asking more questions. We hope that you leave here asking more questions about life and God and faith and love. But within that question, why does God allow? There is, I believe, a presumption. There is a presumption that indeed God does allow. Or at the very least, God just sits back and watches as bad things happen. Which begs the question that if God is all-knowing, if God is all-powerful, then why does God just sit there? Sit there and allow these terrible, awful things to happen. That presumption that God does allow is personally one that I can't embrace. I cannot embrace that idea that God just sits there and waits and watches and allows. A theology that suggests that God causes or that God allows as some form of divine retribution or punishment takes me personally down a rabbit hole of faith that I refuse to enter. To believe that God does allow goes contrary to a fundamental belief that I must hold fast and I must hold true as to the nature, the very nature and core and being of God. And that is that God is love. And that God's grace overcomes all things. For God's grace and love to be at the core of who and what God is, I cannot believe that God allows, especially as some form of divine punishment. Now I want you to know, I blame Augustine. I blame St. Augustine for it all. And after all, since we live in a society where it seems that we are free to blame others or even God for our lot in life or for suffering, be it consequential suffering or just plain suffering as fate. So jumping on the blame game bandwagon, I am going to blame Augustine for it all. And I want you to blame Augustine for it also. And why not? After all, he is the one who most deeply developed, the one who gifted the church some 1,600 years ago with this doctrine of original sin. This idea that we humans since birth, even before in the womb, have a propensity not for good but for sin. And that it is our nature to pursue not the ways of God but the ways and the desires of self. Or to put it as the Apostle Paul did, matters of the flesh. I think it's possible, actually likely, that Augustine has shaped our theology, our understanding of God, probably more than anyone else has throughout all of Christianity, has shaped a human being's image of God and humanity's image of self. Because Augustine made it quite clear in his writings that we share in the fall of Adam and Eve. That even today, you and I still bear the brunt of a decision that was made in the garden. That human desire to be something we were never intended to be or created to be has been passed down. Biologically, genetically, passed down since the day first humans stood upright and walked the earth. Now, I would ask you if that seems fair to you, that we pay for the sins and misdeeds of our forebears. But honestly, I'm not really one who thinks in terms of fair and unfair. I don't disagree with the part that humanity sins. I don't disagree with the fact that we choose more often than not our ways as opposed to God's ways. But you see, Augustine in his writings, he drew two conclusions that I absolutely cannot accept. The first of which was that humanity, all of humanity over all of time was present in the garden. And that through human sexuality, sinful nature has been passed down from person to person, generation to generation. Now, first of all, I believe that conclusion has more to do with Augustine's own guilt as to the life he led prior to his conversion to Christianity. And two, I believe that conclusion would explain all of our hang-ups about all things pertaining to human sexuality since then. And the second conclusion that Augustine made that I cannot fathom is that God punishes us. That God punishes each of you. That God punishes me for the sins of those who have come before us. I won't believe that. I simply cannot and will not believe it. So who is it who sinned, the disciples asked? His mother? His father? How about himself? That's right. Within the question itself that the disciples asked Jesus is also another presumption. That the man himself, before birth, while still in the womb, had somehow, some way sinned. It is an idea that the ancient people truly held, an idea that has its origins dating back to the story of Jacob and Esau. That a person could sin prior to birth. So the question of why was this man blind? Whose fault is it? Why did God allow this? These questions are millennia old. Yes, predating Augustine, who I still blame. And the response to Jesus, the response of Jesus, is beautiful. He says, and I appreciate Pastor Josh highlighting this, and I heard your answer, so I know you heard this. Jesus said, it doesn't matter. He simply says, it does not matter. Now, he doesn't suggest that this man or his mom or his dad are without sin, but he just simply says that you're looking at it, that we are looking at it the wrong way. This man's blindness, we're looking at his blindness the wrong way. Because sometimes, church, sometimes stuff just happens. Stuff happens that has no explanation whatsoever. Things we cannot explain, things that we do not want, things that cause us to struggle and to wrestle and grapple with life and ourselves. And we, because we're human, we mistakenly place the blame on God. God did this to me. God let this happen to me. God has allowed this to happen to me. And I believe it's out of our anger and our desperation that sends us there. Sometimes it's our own arrogance and our own ignorance as well. We don't want to look in the mirror and see that maybe we or someone we love played a role in the contributing factors within a situation. You know, my dad died when he was 59 years old. That gives me 13 more years till I reach that age. And everybody tells me, he was a young man. He was a young man. And the older I get, the younger my father was. And his death was tragic. And it was life-changing and life-shaping for me. And I could have railed against God, and I could have blamed God. Why did God allow his heart attack? Why did God let it happen? But here's the truth. My dad drank more than he probably should have. He didn't exercise at all. He never went to the doctor. And he smoked 2 to 3 packs of cigarettes a day for 35 years. My dad was a workaholic. And he constantly lived in a bubble of stress his entire adult life, especially after he divorced my mother. So the question is, did God allow that or make that happen or just let it happen? Or did my father play a role in his own death? Now the good news, church, is this. I believe that God is big enough to have our anger and misdirected blame placed on God's shoulders. God's used to it. Humanity has been blaming God for thousands and thousands of years for war and disaster and death. And we've become so good at blaming God that we have written down our blame and called it Scripture. So not only is God big enough, God is graceful enough, and God is loving enough. So much of this boils down to an important question of life, a matter of faith and belief that we all must ask ourselves at some point along our journey. And that question is this: what is the nature of God? What do we believe, what do I believe personally to be the very nature, the very core, the very heart of God? Your answer, how you answer that question, creates what ethicists and philosophers refer to as if-then scenarios. If you believe this, then you must also believe this. If God is love, if God bestows grace, and if God's grace that God so freely bestows overcomes all things at all times for all people, then God does not allow, especially as some form of divine punishment and retribution. I want to return to Augustine for just a minute. According to Augustine, there were only 2 places that a human soul could reside: heaven or hell. And according to Augustine, that yes, even unbaptized infants, according to Augustine, would go to hell. And that was a belief that was held by many within the church for hundreds of years, throughout the Middle Ages especially. And that, of course, began the tradition of infant baptism. Now, this may sound more like a history lesson than proclamation or inspiration. But that question of why does God allow, or even if God does allow, And how you answer that question sets into motion a series of other answers and beliefs to other questions. And your response, not just with your brain or by your voice, but in how you live, has the ability to redefine your whole understanding of who and what God is. You know, one of the things that Pastor Josh and I are called to do, and I think it's the most important thing that we as pastors are called to do. We have the opportunity, the gift, the blessing, the honor of helping God's people define and shape and sometimes even redefine their image and understanding of God and the nature of humanity. And if we are not, whether together, whether it is one-on-one or as a community, if we're not grappling with these questions and ideas about God, then we're not being faithful to our calling. And if you are not wrestling with these ideas and questions about God, then you're not being faithful to your baptism or your call to be a disciple of Jesus Christ. To talk about the nature of God, the core of who God is. That is at the center of these big questions of how and why things happen in the world. So in the midst of asking those questions, stop and think about your own image of God, of what you believe to be at the core, at the heart of who and what God is, and go from there, moving outward. And I would imagine that over time you will begin to let God off the hook. And hopefully, over time, maybe you will even let yourself off the hook from time to time. And realize that sometimes there's just not a good explanation for why some things happen. Sometimes we suffer. Sometimes our loved ones suffer. Sometimes a man is born blind. And then, in those cases where there is good reason, to understand why something happens, that something being like war or famine or racism or poverty, be willing in the midst of those questions and those issues, be willing to look at and for the root human causes of those things. The root human causes of war and poverty and famine and bigotry and hatred. And find ways in the name of God as a witness to your faith in Jesus Christ to address those root causes so that the work of God might be revealed through you, through that situation. After all, that's the answer Jesus gave. It doesn't matter why this man was born blind. What matters is, what do you do with it? How do we respond? How does the work of God and the love of God and the grace of God found in Jesus Christ, how is that revealed in this situation? When we were discussing the topics that you gave to us, it was actually Pastor Josh who threw out this text from John. And when I went back and I read the entire 9th chapter, and I saw the question of the disciples, who is it that sinned to cause this man's blindness? I knew that the Spirit was working through Pastor Josh that day, and I knew that it was the perfect text. When we hear this text, there's a tendency on our part to, just as the disciples did, focus on the man's blindness and on whose fault it is. We do that, and we do that a lot. When things are not like we want them to be, when my life is not like I think I deserve, whose fault is it? Who can I blame? You, them, the government, God? Who can I blame for my lot and my situation in life? But then, and I think this is important, when we focus here on the blindness of the man, and when we focus on the question of sin, we are missing the bigger point of Jesus and the gospel writer John. Because as Professor Gail O'Day points out, that focus is misguided. Thus, it turns the tables upon our own blindness rather than the man's own blindness. We reveal our blindness to the situation. To quote Gail, for John, sin is not a moral category about behavior, but rather sin is a theological category about one's response to the revelation of God in Jesus Christ. So, the man's blindness is not an occasion for reflection on the sin and its causes, but rather the man's blindness is an occasion to see God being made known in the world. The need that evokes the miracle is not the beggar's blindness, but the world's blindness, our blindness, my blindness, your blindness, and our need to see God in action within the world. Tragedy happens. Tragedy happens. Sickness, disease, suffering, and oftentimes these things are inexplicable. I wish so much. I wish I could, in the times when I've had to sit with a family, I wish I could explain how and why little children suffer from cancer. I wish I could explain that to a mother and father, but I have zero words. All I can do, all anyone can do, is just sit and be, and through that being, hopefully, possibly reveal the work of God in the world. I wish I could have an answer as to why, in the times when I have sat with families, why someone who has lived a vibrant and energetic life suffers from dementia and Alzheimer's in their later years. I wish I had an answer, but I don't. And it's only natural to seek explanations as to why. And in our human limitations, we grasp at straws, and we're often left with trying to explain that which is inexplicable by passing it off to God. It's God's will, God allowed, God let, God made. And I don't think any of those things reflect the true nature of God. A God who created out of love. A God who dwelled among us as human, filled with grace and truth. Sometimes we bring suffering upon ourselves and on others. Our own greed, our arrogance, our ignorance, our desires to place ourselves first. Sometimes we bring suffering on ourselves and others. And we forget that oftentimes our actions set off chain reactions like ripples through a pond. And when the consequences of such arise, do we look at ourselves? Rarely. We blame God. Rather than, as Jesus said, focusing on the ways in which God is at work in the situation. Tomorrow, June 12th, is the 1-year anniversary of the shooting in the nightclub in Orlando that left 50 people dead. People talk about the gunman. People talk about the loss of life. How often do we talk about the hundreds, if not thousands, of people who lined the blocks all throughout Orlando and Florida, lining up to donate blood to help the victims? How often do we talk about all of the good things that result in the midst of great human suffering and tragedy? You know, when Hurricane Katrina hit, we had two moronic televangelists saying that it was God's punishment, God's divine retribution for normalizing LGBT persons. It made me sick. We blame God rather than perhaps seeing the consequences of global warming or poor and greedy choices about levee placement and construction, or just saying that, you know, sometimes floods and droughts and hurricanes and tornadoes happen. Because we focus on that rather than seeing human beings rallying to be the presence of God. That, y'all, that is what we need more of. Yes, we need people to ask the big questions of why and how. But we also need people of faith. People of faith to be responding to the circumstances of life, not with blame, not with trying to say whose fault this is your fault or her fault or his fault. Or we waste time, so much time, doing that. We need to be spending more time trying to be the very presence of God, so that God's work, as Jesus says, might be made known. Amen? Amen.